A young pale-faced boy aimlessly wandered the streets of Mizurufu, Japan, as the setting sun cast long, dark shadows on the streets. His mop of dark green hair was long and unkempt, and served to shroud his tired and dull green eyes. The streets were not particularly busy this evening, but people still moved to get out of the teen's way. Izuku Midoriya trudged down the street. His doting mother, Inko Midoriya, had spent weeks begging her son to go out. His life, dreams, and views of the society he lived in had been destroyed. Nearly a month ago, Izuku met his hero and idol All Might. And after divulging that he was quirkless, his idol told him to give up on his dreams. Later that same day, he had rushed in to save his bully and once friend Bakugo from a villain, only to be yelled at by a bunch of useless heroes that sat on the sidelines and did nothing. On his way home after the attack, All Might had visited him and scolded him for his actions, with the villain stating,
"Without a quirk to aid you in attacking that villain, you did nothing but become a senseless liability. You made everything worse by being there. If I hadn't stepped in, you and that young man would have died."
The news covered the whole incident later that week. A photo of Izuku was plastered on the screen for all to see alongside Bakugo.
Earlier this week, a young man by the name of Akatsuki Bakugo was taken hostage by a villain in pursuit by the #1 hero All Might. Brave heroes had secured the area in preparation to apprehend the villain when a quirkless child, Izuku Midoriya, broke onto the scene, disrupting heroes and endangering the hostage. Fortunately, both individuals were saved by the #1 hero All Might. As the head of the Bureau of Hero Relations, what are your thoughts on this, Mr. Yamada?
Asked the news host. Izuku sat transfixed by the TV. While, yes, it could be argued that Mr. Midoriya's efforts were heroic, the sheer stupidity of a quirkless boy trying to fight someone with powers far beyond himself just shows how uncaring and oblivious he is to the work of a hero. I don't think that the boy's act of vigilantism should be praised. He needlessly put the lives of himself and all those around him in danger, Mr. Yamato said, staring emotionlessly at the camera. Tears streamed down Izuku's cheeks. But, that wasn't what I was trying to do, he sobbed. Everyone was just standing there doing nothing. I had to do something. Heroes act when no one else will. Mr. Yamato continued when the photo of Izuku popped up on screen again. It has come to the Bureau's attention that Mr. Midoriya has applied to attend the prestigious Hero School of UA. I could not in good conscience suggest that any hero school or agency accept an application from someone as selfish or as socially harmful as Mr. Midoriya. Inko quickly turned off the TV, tears streaming down her face. She turned to Izuku. I'm so sorry, Izuku. What they were saying was so unfair. Izuku raised his head and Inko's tears turned to full sobs. The light and hope that she had been used to seeing in the eyes of her son were gone. He no longer had tears streaming down his face, but was altogether void of emotion. I'm going to my room, he said, slowly shuffling away. As he entered his room, he let his eyes wander around. All Might's smiling face was plastered across his walls. Izuku felt his anger, rage, and sadness boil up to the surface. Letting out an inhuman scream of rage, he bolted around the room, tearing posters of All Might off the walls. He flipped his desk, smashing his All Might figurines, and threw his notebooks on heroes and quirks to the floor. Izuku heard the footsteps of Inko as she came sprinting up the stairs. Izuku, are you okay? Izuku, answer me! She yelled, banging on his bedroom door. Izuku slowly opened the door, his face once again void of emotion. I'm fine, Mom. Do you have a garbage bag? I need to clean my room. Inko's hand covered her mouth as she stifled a shocked gasp. To her, it appeared as though a tornado had torn through her son's room. The boy who sat in front of her seemed nothing like the loving, happy boy she had raised and known. Over the next few weeks, Izuku became more withdrawn and reclusive. At school, everyone complimented Bakugo and how he survived a villain encounter. At the same time, everyone began treating Izuku as if he were a disease, with most of his classmates calling him a villain. His bullying became worse, with beatings, burns, and bruises becoming a regular occurrence. Inko had confronted the school about the wounds on Izuku, as he made no attempts to hide it. She had become more and more frustrated as the school continued to deny any bullying taking place, and instead claimed that Izuku had a record for being problematic. Eventually, Izuku stopped going to school altogether, instead staying home and watching TV or locking himself in his room. He had begun to find it harder and harder to do regular tasks, no longer finding any meaning or joy in anything. Inko, worrying for Izuku's health, began insisting that he go out. Reluctantly, Izuku got out of bed. He had grown slightly taller over the month that his life had taken a downward spiral. At the same time, he had become somewhat thin due to his lack of desire to eat. "Sure thing, Mom," he said in a monotone voice. He pulled on a dark green hoodie and made his way to the door. The sun was low on the horizon and started to cast long shadows down the street. "Let's get some matcha," Izuku mumbled to himself as he began to make his way to a convenience store. The trip itself wouldn't take more than 10 minutes, but he could cut it down if he took a shortcut through an alleyway. Izuku kept his head down as he walked, doing his best not to draw any attention to himself. Unfortunately, fate had different plans.
"Where have you been, Deku?"
Came an angry voice of his tormentor ahead of him. Bakugo stood in Izuku's path with two of his lackeys on either side of him. "Villain like you should know to move aside in the presence of future heroes," sneered a winged boy at Bakugo's left. Izuku stood to the side, his face never showing any emotion as he held his arms out, gesturing that the path was clear. Bakugo began to fume.
Damn it, Deku!
He said, grabbing Izuku and pushing him against the wall.
What the hell happened to you? You've always been a weak pushover. You at least had a spark in your eyes. What happened?
Bakugo growled, small puffs of smoke leaking off of his hands. Izuku looked Bakugo in the eyes. "I did what you and everyone else told me to do. I gave up." Bakugo took a step back, shocked.
Let's go, guys,
Bakugo said as he turned and walked away and continued walking down the street. The other two looked back and forth between Bakugo and Izuku before following behind. A pair of eyes watched curiously from the nearby alleyway as Izuku pushed himself off the wall and continued walking. The figure backed up into the alleyway and waited as Izuku began to pass. As Izuku crossed the threshold of the alley, the figure stepped out of the shadows, revealing a 7-foot-tall, porcupine-looking man. Quills sprouted from the back of his head and heavy-muscled shoulders. Reaching out a clawed hand, he quickly snagged the back of Izuku's hoodie. Izuku felt his feet raise off of the ground as he found himself flying backwards through the air. He felt his breath being forced out of his lungs as he slammed into the brick wall of the alleyway. Struggling to breathe, Izuku fell to his knees. "Alright, kid, give me all you got," snarled the villain in front of him. Izuku just sat there trying to take a breath. The villain began to get frustrated. "What, are you deaf? I say, give me your money!" He planted another kick into Izuku's gut, pinning him to the wall. Izuku struggled to breathe, feeling the weight of the boot holding him to the wall. He had felt void of emotion for the longest time, but now all he could feel was fear. Izuku heard the sound of someone walking along the streets at the alley's entrance. Looking at the entrance and feeling the faintest sensation of hope, Izuku began to call for help. "Someone help me! There's a villain here!" Izuku shouted. As he did, he saw a costumed hero silhouetted in the light of the sun. He wore a racing jacket and had a helmet on his head, obscuring anybody from being able to see his face. Izuku had recognized him as the racing hero Overgear. He wasn't a super strong hero, but he was a fast hero. Not as fast as many of the pro heroes of the Ida family, such as Ingenium, but still fast. "Please, help! He's a villain!" Izuku shouted again, pointing at the man who had a boot to his chest. Overgear sat silently, taking stock of the situation. His head moved back and forth, from the villain to Izuku before slowly backing out of the alleyway and continuing down the street. Izuku felt his heart stop. The villain laughed. Oh, kid, this is not your lucky night. Reaching down, he grabbed Izuku by the neck and lifted him up. He began to reach into Izuku's pockets, pulling out his wallet and phone. Izuku struggled against the grip of the villain as his stuff was being taken away. Izuku began to feel rage about being abandoned. He began clawing and kicking at the villain and struggling in any way to be able to break free from his grasp. In a last-ditch effort, Izuku kicked as hard as he could into the villain's crotch. The villain doubled over in pain, letting go of Izuku. Landing on the ground, Izuku was forced to try and run around the villain to get to the street. As he was about to reach the street, Izuku heard a roar from behind him. And glancing back, he saw the red eyes of the villain quickly gaining on him. Izuku tried to run faster, but could already tell he was running on steam. He felt a clawed hand grip him around his throat from behind. He felt himself crash against the garbage can before falling to the ground. Izuku coughed up blood. I gotta give it to you, kid. You've got a lot of guts. You definitely put up a lot more of a fight than anyone else I've tried to rob. The villain reached down, grabbing Izuku by the throat and lifting him. I have a lot of respect for you. But bad kids that disrespect their elders need to be punished, he said, grabbing a handful of quills from his shoulder and yanking them out. He smiled sadistically as the quills began vibrating and forming together into a thick spike. Please, help! Izuku choked out weakly. The villain then drove the spike deep into Izuku's gut, causing him to scream out in pain. Don't worry, kid. I'm sure a hero will come around and get you to a hospital. Chuckled the villain before dropping Izuku in a new growing puddle of blood. The villain turned. He quickly pulled out Izuku's wallet, pulling out all the cash that he could from it before casting it aside, and quickly made his way out of the alley, disappearing into the street. Izuku sat panting in a rapidly growing pool of his own blood. He felt his head swimming as he attempted to stand. Darkness began creeping into the corners of his vision as he began to find it harder and harder to keep his eyes open. His hands and feet were beginning to feel numb. Propping his back against a trash can, he attempted to call out for help. His voice sounded to Izuku as though it was little more than a whisper. So this is it, Izuku thought. This is how I die. Bleeding to death, abandoned in an alleyway. He felt hot tears sting his eyes as he tried to keep them open. I can't believe I wanted to be a hero. What a fucking joke. There's no such thing as heroes. Just attention-seeking, self-serving monsters, Izuku thought bitterly. He remembered a cold and dismissive All Might, his constant tormenting from Bakugo, his neglectful teachers and always defending the horrible acts of his classmates. His mind wandered to Overgear and how he just walked away and let this happen. This world is disgusting. They all deserve to suffer for the things they've done. Izuku felt a fresh string of hate-filled tears burn at the corner of his eyes. His vision was beginning to fade faster.
Do you wish for them to suffer?
Asked a voice that appeared to come from everywhere around him.
Do you want to make them suffer?
Izuku slowly turned his head back and forth, trying to find the source of the voice. He already felt cold, probably due to blood loss, but when he saw the shadows collecting into a horrifying skeletal visage with glowing violet eyes in front of him, he felt his blood freeze. Izuku struggled to breathe as the thing began to crawl forward, only stopping inches in front of Izuku's face. The creature opened its wide mouth, licking a long, slimy tongue along Izuku's chin, tasting his blood.
I can give you the power to make them suffer.
Purred the creature into Izuku's ear.
Unimaginable power that can even make the mightiest quake in fear.
Izuku could feel his consciousness fading fast. Do I want this? He thought to himself. Do I want to keep on enduring this nightmare, being weak? I could just let it all be over. Die now and slip into non-existence. Maybe I'll get my quirk in my next life. That last thought triggered a deep burning from within. Izuku remembered his harsh treatment by Bakugo and everyone in his messed up society. No. Nothing's gonna change if I die. All their sins will be erased with my passing. If I had power, I could make them change. Make them see their mistakes. Make them regret what they've done. Izuku forced his head up to look at the creature in its glowing eyes. I accept, he croaked out. The creature grinned. Its smile cracked up its skull like some demented Cheshire cat. Leaning back, it drove its claws into its chest, pulling out a clump of flesh. It began to mold and shape the lump of shadowy flesh until it resembled that of a heart. Once it finished, it turned its attention back to Izuku, its cruel smile growing wider still. Pulling its arm back, the creature drove its hand into Izuku's chest. Izuku felt a searing pain spread through his body. It felt as though his very body was being burned from the inside out. He then felt the sensation of being lifted and pulled forward. He screamed in agony as every fiber of his being felt as though it were being ripped apart before everything went dark. Izuku heard the sound of sirens. Opening his eyes, Izuku saw a dark sky above himself. It looked different for some reason, almost as if there were more stars, or that all of the light pollution had been stripped away. Standing up, Izuku looked around. A heavy mist filled the alleyway around him. He could see the flashing red and blue lights from down by the entrance of the alleyway. Izuku remembered everything that had just happened. Looking down, he grabbed at his stomach. The wound was gone, but a hole in his hoodie still remained. Smiling, Izuku began to make his way to the alley entrance. Izuku saw two paramedics come rushing into the alleyway towards Izuku. Hey, I'm alright, Izuku said, approaching the paramedics. Izuku had expected them to acknowledge him or give some sort of response, but they didn't seem to hear him. Izuku braced himself to be knocked over, but his breath caught in his throat as one of the paramedics rushed through Izuku as if he wasn't there. What the hell was that? Izuku shouted, looking down at himself. He seemed fine when he looked down at himself. Swallowing deeply, Izuku slowly turned around, fear bubbling up in his throat. It's a damn shame, said a taller paramedic with a horned mutation. He was obscuring Izuku's view of what he was doing. I know. Kid doesn't even look that old. It's a pity Overgear wasn't in the area sooner, the short paramedic said, stepping away and grabbing a body bag. Izuku had a few seconds to spot a pair of legs wearing red sneakers on the ground. Izuku felt his breathing become erratic as he began to panic. Stumbling backwards out of the alleyway, he began to call out. I'm here. Hello? I'm right here. He frantically waved his hands in front of police officers and paramedics that were blocking off the area. Oh, I can't be dead. I can't be dead. I can't be dead. He muttered to himself, becoming overcome with his panic. Alright, so how did you come across the body again, Mr. Overgear? Asked a dark-haired detective. Izuku turned to see a detective standing a little ways away from an entrance of the alley with Overgear. Well, I was doing my rounds when I decided that I was feeling a little hungry, so I made my way towards this little food stall in this part of town. That was when I smelled blood. Overgear folded his arms and shook his head, his helmet visor reflecting the flashing red and blue lights. Izuku felt a fire ignite in his chest. He's lying. That bastard listened to me call for help and ran away like a coward. Anger began flooding his body. Liar. Liar! Liar! Detective Sakauchi, I just wish there was some way I could have been here and prevented this. Overgear said, his voice quivering. Fury overtook Izuku as he ran over to the detective in Overgear. Izuku tried to push the hero over, falling through him as he shouted, You could have done something! You're a liar and a monster! Izuku stood up and rushed in front of Overgear. He felt his eyes becoming hot. Not with tears, but some unknown power. I'm dead because of you. Look what you did to me. You don't deserve to live with my bodies lying in that alleyway. Izuku roared. Overgear's eyes went wide with terror as he stood in front of Detective Sakauchi. He He had been talking to the detective, making up his best sob story yet, when suddenly the emaciated body of a boy from the alley was standing in front of him. He was a harrowing visage. Blood covered his face and his body was mangled and torn. Overgear took a step back in terror as the image of the boy began shouting at him in the most terrifyingly monstrous voice.
I'm dead because of you. Look what you did to me. You don't deserve to live when my body's lying in that alleyway.
It yelled. "Get away from me!" Overgear yelled, falling to the ground. "You're dead. You're dead. How did you get here? What are you talking about?" Detective Sakauchi asked, confused. Izuku felt his eyes cool as surprise overcame his rage. "He just saw me," Izuku thought. Izuku watched Overgear turn into a terrified mess on the ground when a sweet aroma assailed his nostrils. Closing his eyes and inhaling deeply, Izuku felt a hunger from within him begin to rise. Opening his eyes, Izuku saw a faint purple mist wafting off of the cowering Overgear. He felt a voice from deep within himself begin to fill his mind. "Feed," it demanded. Licking his lips, Izuku felt his eyes burn once more. He watched in pleasure as the hero Overgear began to scream as Izuku approached. Following his instincts, Izuku opened his mouth wide, feeling his jaw begin to unhinge as he began to inhale deeply. The purple mist that surrounded Overgear began to grow into a thick fog that surrounded him. It began to coalesce into a vortex being sucked into Izuku's mouth. Izuku felt himself being energized with each breath as Overgear writhed below Izuku in pain and fear. Izuku pulled himself away, feeling himself approaching a terrifying state of frenzy. He felt the heat in his eyes fade as he took a deep breath to calm himself. Looking down, he found the hero Overgear unconscious with Detective Sakauchi crouching over him. "Someone, call the paramedics over here. Get this man to a hospital," Detective Sakauchi called to some of the officers taping up the alleyway. Stumbling away from the scene, Izuku scanned the street. When he did, he saw a shifting, shadowy mist churning in the alley not far away from him, before vanishing. Izuku began to remember the creature that had offered to save him and give him power. He remembered how it seemed to crawl out of a very similar shadow. Looking back one last time at the scene behind him, Izuku turned and began to run to the alley where he had seen the shadows. Rounding the corner, Izuku saw the figure crawling across the wall of the alley before once again slipping out of view. Izuku continued his chase, pushing his legs to go faster. He skidded around the corner, entering into the street. He stumbled as he accidentally ran through a round-faced girl with blush marks on her cheeks. Looking back, he saw that the girl didn't seem to have noticed him. He began scanning the streets once again, looking for the creature. Squinting through the ever-present fog, he saw it again crossing another street, climbing a building. Taking a deep breath, he sprinted after it again. As he ran, he realized the creature was getting farther and farther away from him. As he ran, he realized the creature was getting far enough away from him that he was going to lose it. Izuku dug deep, pushing his legs harder. He felt the same burning sensation that he had felt within his eyes spread through his body. Looking down, he saw a dark mist begin to leak off of his body. He felt as if his body had become lighter, as he found himself getting faster. Keeping an eye on the rooftops, he followed the creature, dodging through the alleyways as the creature leapt from building to building. The creature looked back and made eye contact with Izuku, its glowing, violet eyes boring into him. Smiling, the creature stopped and squatted on the edge of a building. Izuku slid to a stop in the darkened alleyway. He looked up at the creature, grinning down at him.
You learn quickly, my little terror.
Purred the grinning creature. Izuku swallowed deeply, still unnerved by the appearance of the creature. "You told me you would save me," Izuku said, glaring at the creature before him. Chuckling, the creature cocked its head.
I promised you power. Power to make even the strongest quake in fear.
The creature's smile widened.
I never said I'd save you.
Izuku tried to think back to the alley. His mind was running 100 miles an hour and he couldn't think clearly. "What did you do to me? Am I a ghost?" The creature outright laughed, slapping the side of the building.
No, you're not alive. But you're also not dead.
The creature said, slowly crawling down the wall, its head twisting at an unnatural angle to maintain eye contact.
I bound your consciousness to a part of myself, making you into something more.
Izuku started replaying everything that had happened with Overgear again. Then he remembered when he had talked to the creature in the alleyway.
Okay. How was I able to see you and talk to you in the alleyway?
Izuku asked. He had an idea of what the answer would be and desperately hoped he was right.
Our kind has the ability to enter the material plane, so long as we're strong enough and have enough energy to do so.
Creature said, eyeing Izuku curiously.
You wish to return to the material world.
It stated, amused. Izuku began to shift uncomfortably.
Yes. There are still people who I care about that are there.
He glanced up behind Izuku before speaking.
You mean the woman up there?
Turning around, Izuku realized where he was. He was just outside of his apartment building.
Mom.
Izuku said, dread beginning to consume him from the inside. The creature's hand elongated before grabbing Izuku around the waist. Izuku went to protest before he found himself being dragged up the wall to his apartment window. Izuku looked in through the living room window. He saw Izuku Midoriya sitting on the couch watching a movie. He heard a knock at the door and watched as Izuku paused the movie and made her way to the door.
No, Mom!
Izuku shouted. He banged his fists against the window, trying desperately to get her attention. Izuku opened the door to find two people standing outside. Izuku recognized Detective Sakauchi, but he didn't recognize the man wearing all black, with what looked to be a scarf and yellow goggles. Detective Sakauchi began to say something that Izuku couldn't hear before watching Izuku collapse in a mess of tears on the floor. Tears now flowed freely down Izuku's cheeks as he watched his mother grieve. The creature smiled wider as it watched Izuku.
You wish to return to the material plane?
It asked sweetly.
Are you willing to do everything you can to return? No matter what it takes. Even if it means feeding or even killing humans?
Izuku thought back to Overgear and the villain that had killed him. He remembered Bakugo and the bullying he received at school. He remembered All Might and the media condemning him for acting to save a life when no one else would. He felt anger and hate radiate from his core. He wiped the tears away from his eyes, a cold look of determination now replacing it.
I'm gonna get back and tell my mom I love her. I don't care how many people I have to punish to do that.
Good. You shall learn to stalk the shadows of the night like a predator. You will become fear incarnate.
The creature purred.
I have high hopes for you, my little nightmare.